10 talks about buoyancy, and buoyancy is basically the ability for an object to either float or sink in a liquid, and it basically deals with the density of an object and the density of the fluid. And so this lab we will be using Archimedes' principle, and it states that the upward buoyant force that is exerted on a body immersed in a fluid, whether fully or partially submerged, is equal to the weight of the fluid that the body displaces. And so basically we'll be using this online lab to figure out whether an object will float or sink in a fluid. So the equation for buoyancy would be the density of the fluid times the gravitational force times the volume of the fluid. So when it is at rest, it would be 0.3 times 0.67 times 9.8, and you would get 1.97. And then for the weight of the displaced fluid, you would do your newtons, or 9.8 newtons, times 0.2, which was the fluid that was lost right here, and you would get almost the same, or you would get the same value. And that's because the magnitude of buoyant force is almost identical to the weight of the displaced fluid. And you can see, like, my work down here, these are 5 different examples that we had to do for this lab. And buoyant force equals the weight of the fluid displaced, and mass of the displaced fluid equals its volume times density. And right here I use 9.8 newtons because the formula for 1 kilogram would be 9.8 meters per second squared. So I just used it to multiply times 0.2 right here, and that's basically what I did for each of these. And as you can see, the numbers are almost identical, if not identical. And that's basically what I did for activity 1. Moving on to activity 2. How does a sinking object weight compare to the buoyant force when completely submerged? So if the buoyant force is less than the object's weight, then the object will sink. If the buoyant, on to the next one. How does a floating object's weight compare to the buoyant force when completely submerged? If the buoyant force is equal to the object's weight, then it will float. And questions that also go with it would be, what do you conclude in the relationship between buoyant force and the weight of a sinking object? Well, sinking object's weight is greater than the buoyant force. And in other words, the sinking object's density is greater than the fluid's density, which will cause it to sink. And then it asks, what do you conclude in the relation between buoyant force and the weight of a floating object? So Archimedes' principle states that the buoyant force is the weight of a fluid displaced. So for a floating object, the weight of the displaced liquid is the weight of an object. Only in special cases does the buoyant force acting on an object equals the object's weight. And that's basically what activity 2 is. Talks about what